Hello and welcome to TheFIX, a podcast about Photoshop, Lightroom, post-processing, and the cool and creative things we get to do with our images after the shoot. I'm Seán Duggan, your host, and this week's show is a continuation of a topic we looked at in last week's show. Last week we looked at local adjustments, what some call dodging and burning, in Lightroom, and this week we're going to take a look at dodging and burning in Photoshop. Stay with us. Well, thanks for tuning in and joining me. I do appreciate that. So as I mentioned in the intro, this week's show is a bit of a continuation from what we did last week, and that was local adjustments in Lightroom. And that, by the way, was based on a suggestion from a viewer who left that in a comment a couple of episodes ago. So I do encourage you to leave requests and suggestions for things that you'd like to see. I love hearing from the viewers and the listeners. And if you have an idea for a topic to cover, I will definitely take that into consideration. And it will probably show up on a future episode. So definitely keep those suggestions coming. So in terms of dodging and burning, those terms, of course, just refer to the act of lightening or darkening specific areas of a photo. Now, as I mentioned in the episode last week, I typically prefer to do most of my adjustments to an image in Lightroom, and that would include dodging and burning type adjustments where I'm only affecting certain areas of the image. And then I will bring it into Photoshop for things that I can't do in Lightroom. So compositing, maybe some more complex retouching, things like that, or filter effects that I just can't do in Lightroom. Like if I want to blur part of the background of an image. Obviously, that's not something I can do in Lightroom, so I would want to bring it into Photoshop for that. However, once I am in Photoshop doing those other things, sometimes I see areas of the image that I do want to modify and lighten or darken, dodge or burn. And so I will do that using some of the techniques that I'm going to show you on this week's episode. Before I get to that, however, a couple of items of business to go over very quick. The first is the winner of the Rocky Nook book giveaway from a couple of weeks ago. Is Steve Granger, who left a comment on, I think it was episode 60's page. That was the Layer Mask Basics episode where the book giveaway was announced. And Steve, you get to win or choose a book of your choice from the Rocky Nook website, rockynook.com, and we will ship that out to you. So by this time, you probably have already heard from me by the time this episode airs. But head on over to that website, rockynook.com, take a look at all the photography books that they have. Let us know which one you want to have shipped your way, and we will make it so. And thanks for leaving your comment and entering. You did leave a very good comment, or a good suggestion, rather, for a topic for a future show, and we will definitely cover that at some point in the weeks ahead. So thanks again. The other, and then the other thing I was going to mention about the Rocky Nook book giveaway is that it will be back. It'll take a break for a week or so, but it will be back. So if you want to win a book from Rocky Nook, pay attention to this channel, and the opportunity will be coming back again. So the other thing I wanted to mention is that a couple of weeks ago, lynda.com published a new course of mine called the Photoshop Cinemagraph Tutorial Start to Finish. And as the name would suggest, that course is all about using Photoshop to create cinemagraphs, which are those images where it's mostly a still image, but there's a hint of motion somewhere in the scene that just kind of loops continuously. They can be really enchanting and enigmatic images to view. So in that course, we go over the basics of creating a cinemagraph, then we take it a little bit further and we add in some additional compositing. Of course, a cinemagraph does involve some amount of compositing techniques, but since that course is part of my Photoshop compositing series, I do take it a little bit further. We replace the background in an image and create an entirely new scene. And then we also take a look at using motion within the scene to create a transition point for a looping effect where it makes it a little bit more believable, especially motion where the motion is a little bit maybe erratic and unpredictable. So there are 3 projects in that course that you get to work through, and if you're a lynda.com subscriber, head on over there and check that out. I'll put a link in the show notes. And if you're not a lynda.com subscriber, you can go to a special web page that's associated with my account there, and you can get a free 10-day trial. So you can go to lynda.com/trial/Seán Duggan and sign up for a free 10-day trial. And of course, you can take a look at my courses as well as any of the thousands of courses that they have in their online library, covering a huge array of topics. It really is an amazing resource. And if you're interested in cinemagraphs and you're not a lynda.com subscriber and are not interested in subscribing, I actually have a previous episode of TheFIX where I took a look at making cinemagraphs in Photoshop. And I believe that was episode 46. It was back at the end of the year. But I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. All right, so onward and upward to the topic du jour, which is dodging and burning in Photoshop. Of course, since it's Photoshop, there are multiple ways that you might approach that. I'm not going to go into every single possible way. Obviously, time limits prevent that. But I am going to go into some of the most common ways that you might choose to apply dodging and burning type effects in Photoshop, and I'm going to give you my recommendations for the methods that I personally prefer, just because they are a little bit more flexible, open-ended, and allow me more control over how the effect is applied. Let's get started. Well, since this is a show about dodging and burning, let's start with the obvious, which are the dodge and burn tools in Photoshop, and those can be found kind of midway down the tool panel here. The keyboard shortcut letter for these tools is O, and there are 3 tools that live in this section: the dodge tool, the burn tool, and the sponge tool, which controls saturation or desaturation depending on how you use it. By the way, here's a cool little shortcut. I mentioned that the shortcut letter there was O. You can cycle through the different tools just by holding down the Shift key and then tapping O, and you can see how it's cycling through those tools. Now, if you don't want to have to hold the Shift key down when you do that, just come up to the Photoshop Preferences, and under the section for Tools, there is a preference here that says Use Shift key for Tool Switch. So if I uncheck that and then click OK, now I can just press the letter O and it will cycle through the tools and I don't have to hold down any modifier key. So just a little bit of a detour there to pass along that tip. Okay, so back to the burn and dodge tools. Now, I really don't recommend using these. The main reason is that they are not as flexible as applying burning, dodging, or darkening and lightening using other methods. But let's go over these and talk about how they work. So I'm going to select the dodge tool, and I'm going to come up to the options bar for that tool, and you can see that I can choose to adjust a range of tonal values, shadows, midtones, or highlights. I can set my exposure value. Right now I'm set to 70%, just because that's what I was using the last time I used this. There's also a button here that enables airbrush style build-up effects, so that allows you to gradually build up effect and kind of layer it on as you might using an actual airbrush. There's an option here called Protect Tones, which I would definitely suggest leaving on. This will minimize any clipping in the shadows and highlights. That is causing a situation where shadow values get forced to total black or highlight values get forced to total white. And then it will also protect the hues in any colors, so it's going to prevent the hue of the color from shifting when the tool is used. Finally, up here, this last option is to use pressure for size, and that is only going to really apply when you're using a Wacom tablet or some other stylus device. When it's off, the brush preset is going to control whatever the pressure is. All right, so I have this set up here. I'm going to set the dodge tool to the shadows, and let's just zoom up closer on this image here. This is a rocky outcropping looking out onto Lake Superior on Madeline Island, Wisconsin. And so I'm just going to get my brush a little bit smaller here by tapping the left bracket key to make it smaller. I can tap the right bracket key to make it bigger if I choose. And I can paint on here, and you can see that the shadow values there are indeed being lightened up, and it's, working very well. And of course, the nice thing about this is that it is only paying attention to the shadows, since that is what I have set there. By the way, I am able to move my image around here just by holding down the space bar to get the grabber hand. So I can paint a little bit more on here and, lighten that to my heart's content. And that all looks pretty good. So let's zoom out a little bit, and we'll just sort of keep it set on these darker tones here. I'll come to my history panel, and I will just click on the history state for right before I started to do this, and you can see how it has done, a very nice job at lightening those shadow tones. So, fair enough. Well, why would I recommend that you not use that then? Well, there are a couple reasons, actually. One is that the change that I have applied is a destructive change. Now, it may not seem destructive because the image might look better, but the pixels have been irreversibly altered here. You can see that I'm just working directly on the background layer. So once I save my file and close it, I'm not able to easily undo this or modify it at all. Now, of course, in a given work session, I do have my history panel here, and I can choose to come back and modify that by undoing that by clicking back on previous history states. So that's all well and good, but the thing to understand about the history panel in Photoshop is that it's very different from the history panel in Lightroom in one significant way. And that is that, in Lightroom, your history panel is available all the time. You can open up an image that you last adjusted a year ago, and your history states will still be there. And that's because Lightroom does not actually change the pixels in the image. Lightroom is just writing changes to its database record for that file. So it's really just a text file. It's a recipe that says what you've done. Whereas Photoshop is actually changing the pixels in an image. And so once you save the file and then close the file, key concept there is closing the file, the history for that work session disappears. So your history in Photoshop is only available during a given work session. So if I chose to close the file here, save it and close it, and then later on I opened it up and decided that, maybe I lightened it up a little bit too much there, there'd be no way for me to undo that other than by going back over it and darkening it down again. And if enough of that back and forth is taking place, so lightening a really dark pixel and then coming back later on and darkening it down again, maybe re-lightening it, whatever, there is certainly the possibility that you could introduce kind of image quality deterioration to the file. So I tend to prefer using adjustment methods for dodging and burning, or really anything in Photoshop that are more open-ended than what the dodge and burn tools provide. We'll be taking a look at that in just a second here, but let's go and look at the top part of the image where the sky is very bright. That might be a case where I could use the burn tool. So I'll come here and choose the burn tool, which is kind of this icon of a hand kind of cupped in a little circle with an opening in the middle. By the way, if you ever wondered what those icons stand for the dodge tool and burn tool, those harken back to traditional darkroom days, and when you would dodge a print, you would essentially prevent light from hitting the light-sensitive photographic paper by having like a little circular shape on a piece of wire or something that you could come in and prevent light from building up in certain areas of the print, and that would keep those areas lighter, because in the traditional darkroom, or rather a black and white darkroom anyway, more light exposure to the paper would create a darker area. And the burn tool would allow you to essentially focus a little bit of light through maybe a hole in your hand there as you made your fingers into a circle and direct additional light onto a certain area to make that area a bit darker. Of course, you could also use a piece of cardboard with a hole cut in it as a burn tool as well. But anyway, that is what those little tool icons mean, if you ever wondered. All right, so for darkening the sky, obviously I'm going to set my range to the highlights. And, I can come over here and just brush over the sky and darken that down. And, that looks pretty good. But the thing with the burn tool is that if you come over an area, let me just lower my exposure down a little bit more to about 48%. If you come over an area again, you can sometimes end up with these brush strokes where it doesn't quite match. So like on this side, it's a little bit darker than on this side. Obviously, we could come to our history panel and undo that to, get ourselves back to an area where we're not noticing that. But I find it's just a lot easier to end up with more visible irregularities in the brush strokes. Now, that's not to say that some people might be very talented at using the dodge and burn tools, but personally, I like to do my changes a little bit more flexibly using adjustment layers. So apropos that, let me come back in my history panel here and I'll go back to where the image doesn't have any layers at all. And let's talk about that. So I'm going to use my space bar to get the grabber hand just to nudge the image up so I can see the darker parts of this image. And there are a couple of ways I might choose to use an adjustment layer to create a dodging and burning type effect. Again, dodging and burning just refers to lightening or darkening specifically, but of course in the grander scheme it can refer to any localized adjustment that you are applying to a specific part of the image. So the first way I'm going to show you is a method that does not require you making any selection. I'm just going to come down to my adjustment layer button in the bottom of the layers panel, and I'll choose curves, as I tend to like to work with curves. And I'll get the targeted adjustment tool, which is this little hand with the arrows on it up near the top of the curves toolbar in the properties panel. And then I can move that over the image and I can see where that point happens to be on the curve. So in the very, very dark areas, you can see the point is lower down towards the lower left. And if I go to more of the middle tone areas, it's a little bit higher up. So I'm going to come over here to this sort of shelf area of this little rock pillar, and I'll just click and drag up on the image, and that is going to lighten it. So you can actually drag up or down right on the image to apply an adjustment. So it is affecting the entire image, but I am basically targeting that one area there. But since it's all connected on the curve, the entire image is getting lightened. So that looks okay as a start. Next, what I would do is I'd come to the properties panel for the mask, because every time you add an adjustment layer, it does come along with a mask. Currently, this mask is white, which is what the default would be when you add an adjustment layer. White means that the adjustment is applying to the entire image, so it's affecting the entire image. So if I come to the mask button up here in the properties panel where the curve adjustments are, it gets me the properties for the layer mask. Now there is a button in here for invert. I can just click that and it will invert the mask to black, which means it's hiding the adjustment, and now I can just paint it in where I want it to go. Now let me actually undo that to show you one more thing here, and that is the useful shortcut for inverting a layer mask, or really inverting anything in Photoshop that has to do with pixels, would be Command-I on Mac or Control-I on Windows, and that will invert the pixels there in that layer mask, so now it's black. So now I'm going to get my brush tool over here on the tool panel. I'm going to make sure that white is my foreground color down in the bottom of the tool panel there, and I'm going to set my opacity, maybe to about 50% roughly. And now I can just paint on that mask, and I can paint in where I want the lightening effect to show up. So for instance, I don't necessarily want it to be up on the top part of this shelf up here, but I do want it on the sides. So we'll just brush that in. And as I brush over one area, it's going to put down 50% opacity of white. If I brush back over that same area again, it will add in more. So eventually I can get my brush stroke up to be 100% just by continually going over the same area. If I hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows, I can click on the thumbnail for the layer mask, and you can see here the differing values. If I paint right here, that's 50% of white going down, so you see it's kind of gray. But if I paint over it again and again, I can eventually brighten it up to the point where it's going to get to 100%. And of course, as with working with any layer mask, if I exchange my colors using this little curved arrow button next to the foreground and background color swatch, I can then paint with black. I'll just set my opacity up to 100%, and I can get rid of that. So that's, again, the beauty of working with layer masks and adjustment layers. I'm going to Option click or Alt click on the thumbnail of the mask to get back to the main image view, set my color back to white. And I did that, by the way, just by pressing or tapping X on the keyboard. That exchanges those colors. So now I can continue painting in here to lighten some of those areas. And come down and lighten a little bit of this area right here, and maybe so we can see a little bit more into the shadows there at the base of the rock, where the water is sloshing in. All right. So let's zoom out a little bit so we can see a little bit more of this image on screen. So if I turn the visibility for this adjustment layer on and off by just clicking the eye icon, you can see that I have that nice effect there. I can see where there are, parts that I've missed there. I can even tap the backslash key on the keyboard to show me the areas where I have painted here. So the red overlay indicates areas that are black, that are masked, and the clear areas are areas where I painted. So part of these areas here, I can see I might want to continue paint on those if I want a little bit more of that to show up. But typically when I'm making the adjustment, I don't use this view. So I'm going to tap backslash again to turn that off. I actually just look at the image and see what it looks like. And that is what lets me know that, yeah, this is working good. This is directing the viewer's eye or enhancing the visibility of detail in an important area of the picture. So the main concept here that I'd like to get across in terms of using this method to do dodging and burning in Photoshop versus using the dodge and burn tools is that since this is an adjustment layer, one, it's non-destructive. I can turn this layer off, throw it away. I can double click on the thumbnail for the curve here in the layers panel. I can come back and modify it. Oh, maybe I made it too bright. Well, let's just modify that, by adjusting the curve. I can further modify it by lowering the opacity of the layer. So for instance, I could make it, very bright initially, and then I could come here and lower the opacity down. I could even, if I wanted to, use blending modes to modify the effect. And we'll be taking a look at that in a little bit. And I can, of course, modify the layer mask if I need to. So there are multiple ways that I could choose to modify the effect after I've applied it, and I can still do that even after I save and close the file. So I can come back to this file tomorrow or next week or whatever. My adjustment layer is still going to be there, and I can modify that. And I cannot tell you how many times I have opened up a file that I've worked on, and a lot of times this happens when I'm traveling. So sometimes if I'm on a photo trip and I'm actually processing files there while I'm traveling, when I go back and revisit those files, a few weeks after I get back, I often find that, I did a quick adjustment or a quick processing of the image, and I find areas where maybe I overdid it a little bit and I want to back it off. So having my adjustments flexible like this is really what makes it possible to do that, to revisit those changes there. Let's do one other quick change here to this file before we move on to another example. I'm just going to darken the sky down a little bit. So I'm going to add a curve adjustment layer. And I'm going to get that targeted adjustment tool up here in the top of the layers panel. And I'll just click up here in the bright area of the sky and drag down a bit. So something like that looks good. And then I'm just going to use the gradient tool to add a gradient into that mask. So I believe I showed the gradient tool on an episode a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, on layer mask basics in Photoshop. So if you're interested in layer masks and learning them, that might be an episode to watch. So I'm going to come up to the gradient picker. I'm going to click on the third swatch, which is the black to white gradient picker. I'm going to make sure that that first little style icon is chosen. That is the linear gradient style. Then I'm going to make sure my mode is normal, my opacity is 100, and reverse is not checked. And black hides what a layer does, white shows. So I want the bottom part of the image, everything really essentially below the horizon, to be black in the mask, and I want the white to be up in the sky. But I do want to have a little bit of a subtle transition. So I'm going to maybe start dragging midway between the rock here and the horizon, and I'll just drag up to maybe about almost to the top of the little bush that's on top of that rock. Something like that. And you can see in the layer mask how it has added that gradient. I'll Option or Alt click on the thumbnail of the mask so you can see that. Again, black is going to hide what the layer is doing. White is going to show it. Gray is going to show it partially. So that's this transition from the effect, the darkening effect, not being visible at all to gradually becoming more visible until it's fully visible up in the white areas. And, there we have it. So this is dodging and burning as I prefer to do it in Photoshop, using adjustment layers, simply because they are flexible and I have a lot more control over how they're done. Let's go over to another image and take a look at another way you might dodge and burn. One method that I learned early on in Photoshop that a lot of people really love takes advantage of blending modes and the way that those blending modes interpret certain colors. Primary colors of concern would be black, white, and middle gray, or to be precise, 50% gray. So here's the basic way that this works. I'm going to come down and add a new layer. So I could just come and click the new layer button here, but let me show you a trick. If you hold down Option or Alt when you click the new layer button, it brings up the new layer dialog here before it creates the layer. So it allows you to give it a name, and I'll just, I guess, call this Dodge and Burn layer. But more importantly, it allows you to choose a blending mode for that layer. So I'm going to choose the soft light blending mode. And notice when I do that, this option here turns on. The option to fill with a soft light neutral color of 50% gray. So I'll just check that. And now you can see I have this gray layer here. If I turn off the visibility of the bottom layer, you can see that it is indeed gray. Quite exciting shade of gray, I might add. Let me turn that on. But when the bottom layer is on, we don't see it. And that's because the blending mode here of soft light or overlay, that would also work. They do not see 50% gray. It acts like it's invisible. So what that means is you can get colors of black or white and paint on the image to modify the tones in the image. So whenever you paint with black, it's going to darken. Whenever you paint with white, it's going to lighten. So let's just actually start with white. I'll just tap X on the keyboard to exchange my colors. Let me get the brush tool. And I'm going to start with a pretty low opacity, maybe, I don't know, 20%, 18%, something like that. And I'm going to come into the shadows here between the two canoes. And I'm just painting right on the canoe here. Now this might be an option where I might want to use the airbrush functionality here, because as long as I'm pressing down with the mouse, it's going to be essentially adding color to it. So that allows me to build it up gradually. So I might do that there. And I just kind of come over here to lighten that up. Now let's turn the layer off so we can see what we did. So I've added white to the area here, and you can see I can add a little bit more there. So wherever it's gray, again, it doesn't see the gray, but wherever it is white, it is showing that up. So you can see how that is lightening that, or dodging it. Now let's try to do a burn. So the nice thing about this effect is that you can do this on the same layer. I'm going to exchange my colors and paint with black. Again, I'm going to paint with a pretty low opacity here, but I'm going to come over, well, let me bring the opacity up a bit more than that, maybe 45%. I'm going to come over the side of the canoe here And you can see how I can darken that down. However, once you get into the shadows, it gets a little bit dark there. So now I have to switch my colors back to white and kind of bring this back. What I find is that this method, it's easy to end up with sort of irregular areas where you kind of notice the edge, even if you're painting at a low opacity like I am. I'm at 10% now. So I don't like it because it's not as easy to control as an adjustment layer, but a lot of people do really love it. Now, one drawback about this is that it doesn't work when you're painting on areas that are already very, very bright. So if I got my eyedropper tool and I sample the colors of the canoe layer on this bright highlight, I can see that I'm up at about 245. Yeah, 245, 248. So I'm nearly at white there. So if I get my brush tool and I paint with black on this area, let me bring my opacity up to about 30%. It's just not really working to darken down and dull that highlight. Of course, if I stray on either side of it, you can see how it's darkening all that down, but it's not really affecting that highlight. So again, that's something where I feel I have a little bit more control over how I might adjust it using a more conventional adjustment layer. Let me actually throw this layer away just by deleting it, and let me add a new layer, just an empty layer, and I'm going to set the blending mode for that layer down to soft light. What a lot of people don't realize is you do not need to have the 50% gray in there. You can just have an empty layer set to soft light, and if you paint with white or black, you're going to get the same effect. So I'm going to paint with white at about 25% opacity. By the way, a little tip here, when you have the airbrush option on, pressing numbers for the opacity, which is what I just did, I just typed 25 really fast, that affects the flow. But if you have the airbrush turned off, so I just turn the airbrush off, now when I type 25, it affects the opacity. So just realize that that is a difference in how setting opacity will work if you are working with the airbrush options. So I'm just going to paint with white here on this empty layer. Again, there's nothing on it. And you can see I get the same effect here that we had before in terms of lightening and or darkening. So I can come in here and darken the sides of the image here if I wanted to. And here is what that layer looks like. You can see the kind of the white area was right up here, and then here's the dark area. But as I mentioned before, I find it's just a lot more flexible to modify these sorts of dodge and burn layers if I'm using adjustment layers. Speaking of which, let's bounce over to another image and take a look at one other potential way you might use adjustment layers for dodging and burning. Now, in the previous examples that I've shown on this episode, I've just mainly been using the brush tool to brush in the lightening or darkening effect. But of course, you can use selections too. If the area that you want to adjust is distinct from the rest of the image and it would be easy to make a selection, you can of course do that. So that's what I'm going to do here with this image of the boat. I'm going to get the quick selection tool and I'm just going to drag over the shape of the boat here to select that. Let's come up here and make sure I'm getting all the top part of it. Because really what I want to adjust is not the boat, but the grassy area around it. So overall, that looks pretty good. I've got a little bit of a area up here on the top that has selected the foliage in the background, and I'll just press the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows to get my subtract behavior to subtract that. All right, so that looks good. Now, I have a selection of the boat, but what I really want to adjust is the area around the boat. So I'm going to come to the Select menu and choose Inverse. So do you remember earlier when I said that the shortcut of Command-I is for inverting pixel values? Well, what I'm inverting, or as Photoshop would have it, inversing now, is a selection. I'm not really affecting any pixels at all. So it's a different shortcut. If you're a shortcut person, it is Shift Command-I or Shift Control-I on Windows, or just come up here to the Select menu and choose Inverse. And now I have a selection of everything but the boat, so now I can add an adjustment layer. So I'm going to go to my adjustment layer Menu, I'm going to choose, we'll choose levels this time, I guess. Now, I'm not going to make any adjustment at all. This is something a little bit different. I'm just going to leave it set that way. I'll just add that. Well, watch what happens if I come up and change the blending mode for that levels layer. Again, I have made no adjustments at all. If I choose multiply, it darkens everything. Now, it's darkening it too much, but it does darken. Now, the opposite of that, if you wanted to lighten something, would be to choose screen, and it's going to lighten. Again, it's lightening it way too much. Typically, when I use this effect, I will set it to either multiply if I want to darken, or screen if I want to lighten, and then I will drastically lower the opacity. Like maybe come down to at least 50%, sometimes even 30%. So you can see how that is darkening that. In this case, I think maybe 60% might be a little bit better. There we go. Yeah, that looks a little bit more believable. Now, the other thing I want to do in this situation is soften the edge of my layer mask. So if I Option or Alt click on the thumbnail of the layer mask, you can see that it's pretty hard edged here. So let me Option or Alt click on that mask again to go back to the main image. And if I go to the Properties panel for the layer mask, again, the Properties panel when you have an adjustment layer is where you would make your adjustments or modify the active mask. So now I can turn the feather up and soften down those edges. Again, let's Option or Alt click on the thumbnail of the mask so you can see this in action. There it is with no feather, and here it is with a much bigger feather, and I can really feather the heck out of it if I want to. But I just want it to be something like that, maybe, so it's just not as noticeable as the hard edge mask with no feather. I think you'll find that whenever you have a selection edge or a mask edge that is really hard, it will draw attention to itself. The eye really picks up those transitions. But if you feather the edge of the mask, it's going to disguise those transitions. So there we go. That is working out pretty good for darkening that down. Now, of course, I could still modify this if I wanted to by double-clicking on the thumbnail for the levels adjustment, and I could come up and choose to further modify that if I felt it was appropriate. In this case, though, I'm just going to pretty much leave that the way it is. So sometimes if you want to make a quick general darkening or lightening adjustment, you can do this, add a curves layer, add a levels layer. Don't make any adjustments, set the blend mode to multiply, to darken, screen to lighten, and then modify it using the opacity slider on the top of the layers panel, and you can get that very quick lightening or darkening effect. Of course, there are other ways to lighten and darken and apply localized adjustments in Photoshop. This is just a quick drive-by tour of some of the more common methods you might choose to use on your own projects. Well, that about wraps up another episode of TheFIX. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you found it useful. Hope you learned some tips and techniques that you can apply to your own imaging projects. If you are watching this on our webpage, thisweekinphoto.com/TheFIX, please subscribe to the show using the box on the right side of the page. That'll also sign you up for our email list where you'll be notified of new shows, and you'll be able to get some exclusive additional subscriber bonuses. If you have any feedback, comments, or suggestions about the show, you can reach me directly by using our contact form. Just click on the Contact Us menu item at the top of the page, and that's how you can get in touch. I'm Seán Duggan. Thanks very much for watching. See you next week on TheFIX.